Hi, my name's Jenny Yang, and I'm the co-author of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. I'm also the Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, which is based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm also the daughter of immigrants. My parents actually immigrated to the United States of America in the late 1970s, and that migration experience, growing up in an immigrant home, not speaking in the English language as a first language, but as a second language, having different foods, was something that always marked my identity, not just as an American, but really as a Christian. Now, growing up in an immigrant home and being surrounded by other immigrants from all over was something that really helped me shape my understanding as a citizen of this country. But I also grew up in a Christian family where I attended church and had my faith central to who I was. But I never thought about the issue of immigration as a scriptural issue. But my viewpoint on immigration from my personal experience, and not necessarily from my identity as a Christian, is not something that's necessarily unique. In fact, Lifeway research actually found that about 1 in 5 Christians ever hear about the issue of immigration from a biblical perspective within their church. In fact, a lot of Christians actually form their views on immigration not from the Bible or from their local church, but actually from media and from outside sources that may influence how they think on immigration. I think this is a huge challenge for us within the church, because what it means is that instead of having the Bible inform how we are to think about a really tough topic like immigration, we're being influenced by others that may not reflect a biblical point of view. When I started working at World Relief, I started really digging more into scriptures and understanding how the Bible was to form a biblical worldview on the issue of immigration. The first is that when you actually look at the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, what you'll see is that almost every single major biblical character was an immigrant. The first instance of immigration I can think of in the Bible is when Abraham was called by God to leave his homeland and to go to another land that God would show him. He didn't know where he was going, but out of that immigration journey is how he experienced the faithfulness of God. You also see in the story of Ruth, she was a Moabite woman who followed her mother-in-law Naomi into a land in which she became a migrant worker. And it was her position as a migrant worker that Boaz noticed her and actually fell in love with her, and they're one of the greatest love stories in Scripture. But perhaps the greatest immigrant of all in Scripture is Jesus himself. He actually was a refugee when he was a little baby boy, when there was an edict out in which he was supposed to be killed. And so Mary and Joseph had to flee with their baby boy into Egypt in order to save his life. You see, again, many characters in Scripture who are immigrants themselves. But what you also see is that the word for immigrant is ger, or G-E-R, and it's mentioned 92 times in the Old Testament alone. And what you see is that immigrants, widows, and orphans are grouped together as people who are particularly vulnerable because they oftentimes didn't have family or resources or even a community to help provide for them. And so you see this repeated commandment throughout the Old Testament of God's care and concern for immigrants, widows, and orphans. But this idea of care and concern for the stranger is not just limited to the Old Testament. What you find in the New Testament is this idea of hospitality, or philoxenia. That word literally means a love of the stranger, the opposite of which is xenophobia, which is a fear of the stranger. And you see this idea of philoxenia in Hebrews 13, for example, where it says that when we entertain strangers, we actually entertain angels without being aware of it. This idea that there is a blessing in interacting with immigrants is something that Scripture reminds us of. In fact, Jesus himself identifies as an immigrant when he says in Matthew 25 that when I was a stranger, you welcomed me. He's actually saying that when we welcome strangers in our midst, we're actually welcoming Jesus himself. In this session, I hope we can dig deeper into what the Bible actually says. What we can understand about the Bible is that it is not a prescription for a specific immigration policy. But what it does do is give us a framework and a foundation in which we can apply specific biblical principles for how we are to think about the issue of immigration. Immigration is an issue, but immigrants are people. And so as we talk about this issue, we have to remember that people ultimately are impacted, and each of these individuals represents a story and an experience that's unique to them.